panel here. And we've just moved everything up 10 minutes, but we'll have 2 speakers and then Q&A and then lunch. So, oh, I should introduce myself. I'm Salome Fulyoun. I was a DLI postdoctoral fellow with Helen and Lee, who's going to be speaking here shortly, and my affiliation. I'm an incoming associate professor of law at University of Michigan. And I'm going to turn it over to Lee McGuigan now, who's at UNC Chapel Hill. Thanks.
Yeah, I've got yeah. Everyone, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak with you today and the invitation. I'm going to talk about some collaboration between myself and Jake Goldenfein, whom I will summon to the front to answer all your difficult questions later on. So, a paper is called Laws, Consumers, and Platform Users. This is very much a work in progress, so I certainly welcome any critical, constructive feedback about it. I'm going to be talking about online behavioral advertising, which probably many of you know what I mean when I say that, but just briefly, we're talking about a variety of socio-technical systems, some involving artificial intelligence, but not exclusively about artificial intelligence, that are involved in doing things like classification, scoring, probabilistic predictions that ultimately determine the distribution and pricing of advertisements. So these are systems that basically determine what ads are going to be placed where, to whom, at what cost, under what conditions, and so on. Where this paper started was, I came to Jake noticing this apparent inconsistency in the governance of online behavioral advertising, which is that when you enter into a privacy policy or a set of terms of service going into a platform like Facebook, for example, and I'm going to use platform sort of as a shorthand, but where Facebook or Instagram would be paradigmatic of like a self-contained so-called walled garden of ad tech that has these integrated systems. But you could also think about it in terms of the more decentralized but still interconnecting systems that serve advertisements on websites and mobile apps and all the rest of it. So when I say platform, I'm speaking generally about those sorts of things, and I think what we're going to say kind of holds across them, although there's particularities among each of them. So when you enter into the privacy policies, the presumption is that you are a rational actor. You're doing what's something called privacy self-management, which is to say that you have a relatively stable endowment of preferences and capacities, and by being informed about the terms of service, you are able to make reasoned, utility maximizing judgments to give up your personal information in exchange for the benefits of personalization. You'll see advertisements that are relevant to you, you'll see pricing that's personalized, and all the rest of it. Yet the contradiction for me was that on the other side of that contract, when you enter into the platform environment, the presumption motivating all of that collection of information and the profiling that determines the distribution of advertisements presumes that people are not rational, but in fact, predictably irrational. And over the last 10 years or so, the advertising industry has really absorbed a lot of insights from behavioral economics, which tries to identify these cognitive and heuristic biases that people use in their judgments, and integrate those into basically making better bets about what ads are going to pay off, what's going to generate clicks, and all the rest of it. So I came to Jake with this, somewhat naive recognition of this inconsistency, and it aligned very well with some work he was doing about a similar sort of contradiction or tension between the liberal subject constructed in the law and the sort of correlational pattern subject that's presumed and operationalized within cybernetic systems or platform environments, what Jake was calling control environments. And so they turned into this question of who is the actor that's presumed and codified in the governance of online platforms, right? The presumption being that the rational capacities that are assigned to the individuals who enter into these contracts and then into these platforms matter for the governance of the systems, that the protections or exposure that these people are subject to depend on these presumptions and how they're codified in the law and then within the socio-technical environment of the platform. And so basically what we're tracking, sorry, I maybe messed up my slides a little bit. There we go, is the passage from the consumer to the platform user. And this passage is governed by a number of legal regimes, which Jake can probably describe to you better than I can, but I'll go through them briefly. So first is notice and choice. This is the basic paradigm for privacy self-management, where you're notified of the terms and conditions and you consent to them. It's based in things like rational choice theory, which the next speaker is probably the most expert person in the world on that, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But basically, it presumes this typical liberal subject of law and economics, and thus makes their choices to consent to the terms of service legitimate within the law. But then what Jake did was complicate this dichotomy I had set up and find that there's actually some really interesting wrinkles. So then another sphere of legal influence over this set of relationships is consumer protection law. And without going too far into it, this is an area of the law that's also in some ways absorbed behavioral economics and basically come to understand that the marketplace actor is not this, rational utility maximizing actor, although they may seek to maximize their utility. They operate under these constraints, particularly the cognitive biases and so on that I mentioned. And so in a sense, the project of consumer protection is to reduce the exposure of individuals to the sorts of vulnerabilities and exploitations that would be expected of taking advantage of these cognitive biases. As I'll describe in a little bit, it's basically recuperating the rational subject so that he or she can stand on their own legs when we're now assuming that they don't actually act rationally, as the notice and choice regime would presume. And then there's the data privacy, which can be represented by things like the GDPR and other data protection laws that are coming into effect. That basically combines notice and choice with, among other things, some rights that allow individuals to access the information that's collected and used about them in these platform environments, and to, in some sense, have what's called informational self-determination, to narrate themselves who their data persona is going to be, basically. And so these are three things that I'll kind of get to the punchline in a minute about what they mean in terms of the work that they're doing within the governance of online behavior advertising and informational capitalism more generally. So this is basically all Jake. Where I come in is that I studied the history of advertising and technology. So what we were interested in was the ways that these match up in interesting ways with how the advertising business has constructed consumers in variable and somewhat duplicitous ways that basically straddle some of these elements of consumers and users. Without going too far into it, the advertising industry has always maintained this sort of variable understanding of how individuals make choices in marketplace settings, because it's been really beneficial for them in a number of ways. So in some circumstances, there's the presumption that people act rationally and that advertising provides individuals with the information they need to execute their rational capacities within a marketplace setting, right? On the other hand, when advertising professionals are speaking amongst themselves to clients and customers, the individual is presented as being suggestible, is the term that they used to use, drawing on psychology at the turn of the 20th century, to create this idea of a consumer who can be moved by professional influence. And this in many ways elevates the status of advertising professionals, right? If you presume that their behavior can be predicted and influenced by your specialist activities, and that in fact you can't count on them to act rationally, that we need to exercise some sort of a paternalistic form of management over them, advertising professionals become really important to the functioning of markets. And so these sort of dynamics have played out in lots of different ways. The advertising industry is generally extremely opportunistic in the way that it exploits science and technology. So it will take whatever theories and findings are useful to satisfying clients and disarming superiors and so on. But basically where the industry has landed more recently is toward thinking about individuals, particularly this is in the online behavioral advertising context, not so much through this concept of like coherent, personal, autonomous individuals, but more as like sets of patterns and probabilistic correlations that can be mapped and dissembled, reassembled in lots of different ways, in ways that complicate some of these forms of legal governance. Particularly if you think about something like data privacy, we have this idea of informational self-determination, That's really complicated by a platform environment where human scrutability is not important to the conception of the individual who's actualized in that platform environment. We don't need to be able to narrate their identity. They don't need to be, their gender doesn't need to be assigned in a way that would align with their own sense of self, right? It's a probabilistic guess often that changes in different contexts and really depends more on the environment. So we call this the two-faced consumer of advertising. I didn't mean to do all these weird things. So now here's the point I want to get to, and I'm going to read a little bit from our paper just to try and do justice to it. So the point we're trying to make is that the contradictions between the legal subjects of privacy, self-management, consumer protection, and data protection on the one hand, and the two-faced subject of platform-mediated advertising on the other, is that they work to stabilize a set of social relations. Supporting and scaffolding consumer rationality not only protects against the exploitation of consumer vulnerabilities, but is essential to the political concept of consumer sovereignty that puts markets in charge of economic production and consumers in charge of markets. So that is to say that consumer protection law doesn't just protect people in markets, but it protects the sovereign consumer as a salient legal and political identity that is necessary for legitimizing and authorizing market capitalism as a form of socialization, a social organization. So, traditional critiques of capitalist political economy identify how workers autonomously selling their labor through employment contracts participate in building a set of social relations that results in worker subordination. And we argue that the two-faced consumer sort of articulates that dynamic in informational capitalism, that the adoption of behavioral economics and consumer protection and the proliferation of data protection laws work to stabilize the social relations of the platform by holding up the human as a rational consumer, while at the same time exploiting their data and protection as a predictably irrational consumer. So the transition of the consumer into the user speaks to the transition of a human subject through different iterations of capitalist, legal, and social relations. So in other words, what we're saying is that rationality is not so much like a cognitive endowment, but rather a variable and environmentally and institutionally determined construct. Its evident deficiencies in the raw freedom of a liberal chooser beset by systemic biases and vulnerabilities call into action the devices of alternatively data protection to enable narrative authorship over one's identity, or consumer protection to scaffold rationality such that the autonomous and utility maximizing subject can stand on its own, a monument to the validity of market mechanisms. So this rational and calculating consumer is thus free to enter into the terms of platform service, but inside the platform, a peculiar set of devices scaffolds a radically different subject, the platform user, not autonomous and self-determined, but fragmentary, correlational, probabilistic, environmentally contingent. So privacy regulators have continued to advance notice and choice privacy regimes, framing digital privacy as a solution to market failure, subordinating privacy's normative content to ideals of market efficiency. So then what is really achieved through this persistent contradiction and its operationalization within the governance of platform capitalism or informational capitalism? What we're suggesting is that the contradiction is central to the ways that platform capitalism relates itself to individuals and embeds itself into the communicative dimensions of everyday life. To that end, we argue that even if supplemented with whatever expressions of behavioral economics consumer protection might construe, notice and choice not only fails to deliver meaningful privacy, but its real productive function is to harbor a set of relations that legitimize the strategic overlapping of market mechanisms and data-intensive algorithmic management infrastructures. So that's the work of the two-faced consumer in the advertising platform environment.
Yeah, that was amazing and like right on time. So thank you so much, Lee.
Oh yeah, right.
As Lee is de-miking, I will in the meantime introduce Sonia Amadei from the University of Helsinki, as our second speaker. Thank you.
I was so engrossed in that talk, I didn't see the end coming. Oh my goodness. I would just start by saying